So today's discussion will be about reliability and validity. There's probably not much more important in the grand scheme of many researchers' lives than making sure that we have sufficient control over the things that we're assessing and measuring and reporting to know that what we're talking about is actually what we're talking about. And we'll get into that in a little bit of detail. So when we talk about reliability and validity, people will hear these terms a lot of times, and they sometimes will make it a bigger deal than it necessarily needs to be. Basically, the way I like to help you keep this simplified is to remember that basically what we're talking about is consistency and accuracy. So first of all, the main concepts quickly defined here. I'm not going to read slides to you because that would be very boring. But it is important to recognize that reliability and validity are related constructs, but they're very different as far as what we're talking about. The three things I'm going to talk about the most in this presentation is the reliability, and that's basically, as I said, focusing on consistency. So if you have a reliable car, it will always start, is an old example we used to give. If I have an oven and it's very reliable, that means when I set the oven to 350, it always goes to the same temperature. And then, but validity is a little different, of course. What that's getting at is an accurate measurement. So with that oven, it may always go to the same temperature when I turn it to 350, but I know that my oven is actually about 25 degrees off. And so it reliably goes to the same temperature, but the temperature is not the temperature that it tells me it's giving. So if I say 350 and the oven always gives me 325, I have a very reliable, but not a valid thermostat in my oven. Finally, when you talk about a lot of the work that we're doing in research is simple quantitative survey, test scores, things like that. But a lot of it is also based on observations or judgments made by individuals. And a lot of those data also need to be examined to make sure that we're getting a reasonable measurement of what we're dealing with. So we'll talk in this video also about something called inter-observer agreement, which a lot of people used to call inter-rater reliability, which got a little bit of pushback in the world. So we'll call it inter-observer agreement, even though it's more difficult to say perhaps. Okay, I often say that everybody has to see this slide at some point in an advanced program when you deal with a research methods course. That's personal bias perhaps, but for whatever reason, I always saw this pictogram, if you will, trying to explain the difference between reliability and validity. Problem is it doesn't make a lot of sense to most people, except for the one where you're talking about both reliable and valid, that far right one. That means everything is on the mark, valid, and consistently in the same place, reliable. Reliable, not valid, also makes sense with this graphic. Always in the same place, but not on the mark. So if you're an archer and you're shooting arrows at your target, this would be the cluster you would get, or if you're a dart thrower or whatever. Valid, but not reliable is a picture that someone decided to draw. It makes zero sense. You can't be valid when you're not reliable. And the reason you can tell that is just look at it. I mean, the only way that this could actually make sense is to say, well, on average, the middle seems to be where the points would fall, but that's not actually what's going on. Neither reliable nor valid is that other middle one, the third from the left. If it's not reliable, it's not valid, is the simple thing I'd like you to get down to. Because if I can't trust that I'm going to get consistent measurement, then whatever I'm measuring can't be right. Okay, so when we deal with our forms of reliability, you will hear most often about internal consistency. And we'll get into that in a little bit of discussion in a couple of moments. But what we're basically dealing with that internal consistency, and that's actually on the next slide, I'll come back to that though, is a measure with all these reliabilities. The measure is focused on this stability or evenness of the delivery of the device. So the first one that's listed here, coefficient of stability, is classically referred to as test retest reliability, meaning if I give the same test twice, I should get back the same score from the same person, presuming nothing has happened in between. Now, the problem with that is if you take other classes that I've had that I teach focused on learning, we know that merely taking a test in most areas of knowledge acquisition lead to an increase in your scores because you had a learning event. The test itself is a learning event. But when you're dealing with like an assessment, heart monitoring, anything that should not be impacted by having experienced the test itself, you should have a high test retest reliability. And what we're looking for there is to show that it doesn't matter when I take it, it doesn't matter how many times I take it. Every time I take it, I should get back a similar score. We do this a lot just to demonstrate that the measure is stable, durable over time. For instance, I have a test anxiety scale that is used pretty widely. And one of the early studies that we did was we wanted to show that it is stable over time. And what that indicated was that we were measuring basically a stable or trait-like factor in the human experience called cognitive test anxiety, rather than something that is very temperamental to the moment. So we measured it at 3 points in time across one semester and varied how close the next test was for the students, things like that. And we showed that test anxiety performed relatively similar. And so what we were showing there is a coefficient of stability. So whenever you give this test, you should expect to get a similar response. Another one, coefficient of equivalence, which we often refer to as alternate form reliability. That's where you maybe have two different test versions, Form A and Form B. For those of you who do a lot of psychometric testing, there are multiple forms so that you can give two administrations of an achievement test, for instance, without the students seeing the same items, because as I said, you have something called the testing effect, and they may get better just because they've seen the item before. So we have two forms of that. Well, it's very important if you have two forms of an assessment that the two forms are equivalent. And so they'll assess these, have people take both versions, have people take mixtures of versions. You may have, if you've taken a standardized test, a lot of times they'll tell you that we've got a test subtest in here that won't count. We're just collecting data. This is one of the things that they're doing with those sorts of items. The purpose is to make sure that the person, no matter which version they're getting, will have a similar experience so that the answers or the results that I get back are comparable, whether I had the A or the B. People will do this a lot of times in a classroom as well. They'll have two versions of a final exam because they're worried people are going to look at each other's test papers. So if I vary the number of items on a test or the items that you see on a test, that can reduce the probability that a student will just look over and see, oh, well, they got B for number 16, I'll write B down as well. Well, if it's two different questions, of course, that's a silly strategy. But again, you have to be sure that the questions are equivalent in difficulty and operation, and so that's what the alternate form reliability or coefficients of equivalence is. Now, when I jumped the gun a moment ago, I was talking about the coefficient of internal consistency. This is the most common thing that people report in most psychological and educational research studies. And what that's getting at is a measure of the individual item or the individual scale that I'm dealing with right now. Is it measuring something that we can refer to reasonably as a singular construct? Basically, do the items stick together? Or are we talking about a loose collection of items that really don't coalesce into a single entity, if you will? Lots of different ways that people have approached this. I've listed a few. I hear the split half and the Cooter-Richardson. Nobody really uses those except for very specific cases anymore, but those are historically what people had used. The Cooter-Richardson is important if you have a dichotomous scale response, like yes, no, because it'll operate differently than what is the most common is the Cronbach's alpha, which is for a multiple response scale. Like if I have my test anxiety measure that I mentioned before has a 4-point response scale. So we used the Cronbach's alpha when we were first measuring the internal consistency. More recently, McDonald's Omega is offered as an alternative to Cronbach's alpha that a lot of statisticians will tell you is better because it has fewer assumptions to be met than the Cronbach's. I still see Cronbach's more than anything else. Doesn't mean it's right. It's important that you choose one that works for you. Now, When you deal with a Chromebox Alpha, um, you're trying to generate a value, and in a moment I'll talk about the values that are considered acceptable. A lot of people will operate with an acceptable value of zero point 0.7. I'll put that slide up for you. Just historically, this is what people said. With that, and so that criterion value, say if I want it to be above 0.7 on Chromebox Alpha in order to be sufficient. You should know that the values run from 0 to 1 theoretically, although 1.0 is, I mean, it's not impossible, but it's highly improbable. That means that there could be no errors ever, including when the person is completing the test themselves. So anyway, you can never, you'll see I have that in quotation marks and italicized, have perfect reliability, and there will always, also quotation marks and italices, there always some form of measurement error. I put those both in italices and quotation marks because I don't like to ever say never and always, because never and always never work out. But this is one of those that I'm pretty comfortable saying there's always measurement error. Back for a second to that internal consistency. There's a for those of you who are quantitatively curious, when you deal with a scale, one of the enduring properties or qualities of scales that influences the internal consistency or the reliability is the number of items. The more items you have, presuming all of the items are equitably useful to measuring the construct, the more items you have, the higher your reliability tends to be, will be. And the Spearman-Brown prophecy correlation is actually an algorithm that tells you how much you could expect your internal consistency to increase if you added items to it. So the point of my mentioning that is, if you have a scale of 3 items, it would usually be in your benefit to add items to that scale to increase the reliability so that you'll have a more durable and consistent measure. Single item scales are not scales, they're just questions, in my opinion, and most people with measurement experience will tell you the same. The more items you have, the more consistent the measurement can be, and that's what we're looking for. Now, that doesn't mean go create a 40 item scale, right? Within reason. I find that if you're measuring one thing and you're measuring it with good items, usually 7 to 15 items is plenty for most singular constructs. A 5 item subscale is very common. It's a little bit shorter than my usual preference for a lot of constructs, but you have variations for different disciplines. Okay. As I said, there's always measurement error, theoretically speaking. But here are some sources of measurement error that can occur in your research. You can have variations across individuals or within individuals, meaning the same individual can have variations. So if I take the same test twice, one time I'm tired, one time I'm angry, something like that, it can influence your performance. As somebody who studies emotional influences on learning, I, of course, really dial in on these sorts of things. For instance, cognitive test anxiety, that feeling of worry or that focus on things outside of the test itself, and strategies or study processes that are detrimental to your overall outcome. We show that generally it affects about 10% of your performance on a test. 10% is not a huge impact, but it's a difference between an A and a B. So those variations can be sparked in for different individuals or within individuals. So those are all sources of measurement error. Another error measurement location can be variation in the administration. Very commonly, if you have a standardized test, you'll have very specific instructions about how to give the test. And if you violate those specific instructions, you can have extra error thrown into the assessment. For instance, if a teacher is helpful to a child who is taking a standardized test, even though the instructions say do not help the child, that child's score could be positively influenced. During the pandemic, we saw a lot of students statewide assessments that were delivered over the computer at the children's homes. We saw children's scores shoot up dramatically compared to prior years. And the supposition was that they were getting help from parents in those assessments. Not everybody, though, had that opportunity. So you have a real problem when you go to compare student scores if some people had help and some people didn't. That's a source of measurement error. There's also measurement bias. So if your measurement has a bias for or against a subpopulation in your study or in your groups that you're examining. Maybe the items have a bias due to language. Maybe the items have a bias due to cultural experience or prior background or opportunities for engaging in different experiences. Merely not knowing what a dozen means can cause some students to miss questions where the focus of the question really isn't a vocabulary question, it was a math question. So if the question said something like, I have a dozen eggs, and someone takes 3, if I don't know what a dozen is, I miss the question. And that could be a bias imposed by your unique culture or experience in the environment around you. There's also bias imposed by the participants involved in the study itself. People are cheating. People are not really paying attention to your survey. They're just clicking on the buttons as they're going. Could be that some people are trying to fake their responses. So if you have a measure that is used in determining access to services, and the people know that people who have really low scores are more likely to get support in this setting. Something called malingering. People will fake having a disorder in order to get those services. Other people may fake responses because they want to look good. People used to refer to this as social desirability. I'm not going to answer what I really think because then you'll think I'm, a horrible person. So I'm going to say the things that I think you want me to say. And so the responses are not accurate, they're not correct, etc. Some scales will actually have bias detectors built into these. Like the K scale on some measures, I think that's on the MMPI, is the lie detection scale. And basically it says if anybody endorses this item, nobody strongly agrees with this item, that kind of statement. We know that someone is probably trying to misrepresent themselves. And their answers are probably not fully faithful and fully accurate. But these are all areas where measurement error can arise. There's also just simply the process of making a mistake, right? Or in the old school days where we had our bubble sheets and you bubbled in the wrong one, or the classic nightmare that happened to probably all of us at one time or another who had to do these. You bubbled in 2 answers on one line and you didn't find out until you got to the end. You were short one number, so you had to go back and erase everything and refill them in. Those are all points of possible error. Our goal when we're setting up these research studies is to minimize the places of error. So we try to streamline the participants' experience as much as possible so that they're less likely to have these error conditions jump up. Now, as I said, when we have error, one of the things that we do in research is we measure it. We want to find out, okay, how much error is present in the particular scales that I'm using. And one of the common things that it gets reported is referred to as the standard error of measure, which is sometimes abbreviated SEM. For those of you in the quant world, SEM is also structural equation modeling. This is something different, obviously. But the standard error of measure is a representation that uses the reliability of the instrument to give you an estimate of how much I could expect individuals' scores to vary from the reported score that you got. So you fill out a scale, you fill out a test, whatever, and you get back a score. We call that the raw score. So the raw score is my best estimation of your abilities or attitudes or whatever I'm measuring in this circumstance with this particular measure. Now, using that standard error of measure, which is calculated by using some basic statistical checks of the items themselves, like the Chromebox Alpha or this Omega, I get a value. It's called the standard error of measure, and it tells me how much the error could come into play with your actual score. And we often will see this drawn on a graphic with a with a plus or minus like whisker. So you got your dot with a bar that goes up with a line and a bar that goes down with a line with a few, maybe a point or two, maybe 3 points, indicating your score is likely to fall somewhere in this range. Excuse the dogs in the background. Your score is likely somewhere in between these 2 points. That's what we refer to as your true score. I know the score that I got is not perfect, but I'm pretty sure it occurs somewhere in this range. And that range is determined by the standard error measure. Now, to be clear, we never know the true score. It's a theoretical, your ability, we're best estimating this. But that confidence band we refer to, or confidence interval, we're pretty certain. How certain? Usually 95%. You set the level when you choose your confidence bands. 95% sure your score lies somewhere between this score and that score. Now, in reality, we generally just go with the actual reported score. But it's really important that if you have a really high standard error measure, which means you have a really low reliability of your assessment, then you need to take that into consideration and not just assume that you have a good measure of the people in your case. So if you have a bunch of possible assessments and one has really low reliability, I caution you against making major decisions based on that score because there's a considerable amount of error. Now, changing topics just a little bit, moving to validity. First of all, in order for something to be valid, it must be reliable. I remember that we said before. Now, their graphic had all kinds of not reliable but valid. If it's not reliable, it's not valid, okay? And this is one of those mantras that people often say in the research methods courses. They would say, if it's not reliable, it's not valid. It must be reliable to be valid. So, these little rules to make sure that they get these things straight. Whatever you need to do to remember that, pick that up. But there are different kinds of validity that we often talk about, and I want to just kind of unpack those for you a little bit. In the end, all validity is getting back to the simple question of, am I being accurate, or am I getting a faithful and true measure of whatever it is I say that I'm measuring? The term I generally use, because that's kind of the way that I was trained up, is to focus on construct validity. As a psychologist who focuses on educational topics, anxiety, learning, things like that, I'm generally interested in things that can't be directly observed. I can't observe your level of anxiety directly. I can't measure it. There's no ruler for that. So I have to use some sort of assessment tool. Because it's an imprecise thing, we refer to that as a construct. Anxiety is a construct. Intelligence is a construct. How much knowledge you have on a topic is also a construct. Now, I can measure all those things, but I can't measure them directly. What I'm interested in is, how valid is the measure that I have chosen at estimating that construct? So we refer to that as construct validity. What I often refer to as lesser forms of validity, or validity that it's a little less umbrella focused, are often referred to as content and criterion validity. So content validity is traditionally referred to as face validity, which meant the things that I'm looking at on this scale seem to be measuring the topic at hand. And they would just literally ask you to look at the scale and say, hey, are these single digit addition problems? Yeah, sure. And obviously that's a single digit addition problem in front of me, so I can judge that. But the question is it really measuring the person's knowledge of addition? And it may not. Not all addition tests are equivalent. Criterion validity is a little more specific. And when I talked about construct validity being kind of an umbrella, construct validity generally encompasses both content and criterion validity. So criterion validity says essentially it's got a good relationship with things that it should have a relationship with. Meaning I can predict performance on a subsequent task based on this measure, or it lines up very nicely with another measure that I gave you at the same time that I already know is a good measure. So you get that concurrent validity is focusing on, if I have two anxiety measures and you take both of them, they both say you have high anxiety, then you have concurrent validity. And I've already kind of explained this, so I'm going to just leave it up for a second and then you can walk through it. As I mentioned, content validity is basically focused, or used to be referred to as face validity. Do they look right? Um, it's it's traditionally not one that you really focus on. If you see somebody referring to face validity, that usually means they didn't uh, examine the scale with any actual psychometric properties. They just checked it. For those of you who teach and are building, validity and reliability evidence for your assessments, like most people should, sometimes you'll see this represented in what we refer to as a table of specifications or a behavior content matrix, meaning I have broken down the test based on the objectives of the course or of the unit that I'm teaching, and I have the right items in the right places. So if 40% of my class should be about, reliability and validity, 40% of the questions are actually tapping reliability and validity. And I don't have a lot of questions that are fluff or on other topics. The test is really measuring the content of the intended instruction. Finally, construct validity. The face validity is not of any value, but it generally is assessed as part of that, meaning it looks right, but that's not a good measure. Method of Delphi is a process that people will sometimes use to generate construct validity. And what that means is I'm getting some experts who know the discipline, who know the construct that I'm dealing with, and I ask them to judge whether or not the items are effectively measuring the construct of interest. So a couple colleagues of mine who are test anxiety researchers, one's in England, one's in Philadelphia, we're building a new test anxiety scale for children, and they sent me the items, and they asked me to serve as one of their Method of Delphi experts. And so the tasks that I went through is I first ordered the items from like most indicative of test anxiety to least indicative of test anxiety. Then I identified what level of response based on their scale, what I expect a person would have to fill in order to be truly test anxious, things like that. And what they would do with that process, they gave me more items than they wanted to use. They were trying to trim down to the items that were most specific and effective at identifying levels of anxiety. The other important part of that was they wanted to make sure that they weren't missing any aspects of test anxiety. So I would have a place to write in and say, well, I didn't see anything here about this construct or this subcomponent of test anxiety that is important in my opinion. And they would take that in consideration with the views of other judges. Then they send it back out again and say, okay, now this is a revised list of items. What do you think about these items? How do these fit in? Again, order them, etc., and draw the line where this is where I would stop assessing after you rank order them, things like that. So this process is using an expert team to judge items and determine which ones should and should not be used. State assessment teams do this all the time when they're building their third grade reading assessments or fifth grade social studies test. They give it to fifth grade social studies teachers and say, okay, which items effectively measure what we expect to be measured in fifth grade social studies classes in our state. As I said, comparison with other measures, cross-validate, that's that concurrent validity. Another way you can get construct validity is to demonstrate a change of performance due to an intervention. So if I have a pre-test, post-test design study, and you take the test, and then I engage you in a training experience, and then you take the second test that I already know to have high test retest reliability or alternate form reliability, whatever it might be, and I see an increase in your performance on an activity that I know should increase your performance, like tutoring for reading or tutoring for math. You should get better at math after having experience with a tutor. That demonstrates validity of the assessment. It's because it's effective at measuring change that should exist in the condition that you were placed in. You can also have differential population differences as a measure of construct validity. For instance, if I have people who are in a gifted program versus students who are in a non-gifted program, maybe I have an assessment that I'm interested in measuring something related to their giftedness. Or if you have a measure that you believe deals with artistic creativity, and I give it to master artists versus non-artists or people who have no creative expression in their self-report, and I can see differences that way. It could also be based on age. I expect a third grader to have lower average reading ability than an eighth grader, things like that. So you can use these population differences for things that you know should influence their performance to generate the construct validity. And then finally, um, the most important thing with this is to get as many points of data to demonstrate that it's true, you have a truly valid measure. Um, and so most people will mix and match a few of these different things. One other thing that you'll also see is people have a large list of items, and they believe the construct that they have interest in is a multi-factor construct, and they will run the items through a statistical process referred to as a factor analysis. And if the items clump into the factors that make sense based on their understanding of the field, for instance, those of you who don't understand psychology, maybe have history in psychology, will know there's something called the five-factor model or the Big Five personality model. A lot of assessments out there claim to measure those 5 personality traits. So if I have this measure that is meant to measure these 5 personality traits, and I run it through a factor analysis, and it generates 5 factors, and the items that clump together are measuring the 5 things that are best explained by that 5-factor model, then I have some evidence of validity as well. These items are going in the way that the theoretical model should suggest. Okay, now that's reliability and validity from a quantitative perspective. What about qualitative research? We're going to spend a lot more time about qualitative research in the later portion of this semester. However, it's important when we're talking about reliability and validity that we embrace the notion of qualitative research at the same time and just talk about the differences that are relevant. First of all, you can't just apply quantitative strategies to the methods of a qualitative research study and expect you're going to get the similar outcome. There are philosophical differences between quantitative and qualitative research, and it's just not going to work out. Some people will try to use or force qualitative data into a quantitative process by like coding and putting numbers on the codes, but then you're usually violating a lot of statistical assumptions. Also, some people will try to use language like reliability and validity when they're talking about their qualitative assessments, and then they submit the article or the research study to a group of qualitative experts, and they will chafe at the notion that you are using quantitative methodology in a qualitative exploration, so because they're antithetical in many ways. So be really careful with trying to cross over. Now, the same spirit of reliability and validity transfers over to qualitative research, meaning I want to be consistent in my methods. I want to be consistent in my process of observations or of asking questions or of interpreting data. That would be what we refer to as reliability. And I also want to make sure that I'm being accurate and valid and true to the data and true to the constructs. So validity from a quantitative perspective. The difference is that in qualitative research, there is no standard externalized single point in most cases, a benchmark, if you will, by which to validate your conclusions, because the individual differences among the researchers and the participants are often the purpose or the value of the qualitative research in the first place. So if I were to say, well, I didn't come up with that same conclusion when I read your data, that's not surprising in a qualitative study, whereas in a quantitative study, that would be a real problem. If I run an F test and Dr. Finch runs an F test, we should get the same results. But if I read an interview and then you read that interview, we will very likely come up with different interpretations of what the main ideas or important points are. And that's because we all view these things from our own lenses. Okay, so in order to get some level of consistency and some verifiability is a term that you'll often hear when you talk about the validity with qualitative research. I have to start off with making sure that I'm using a coding process that is basically replicable. And even if we come to different conclusions when we look at data, we want to make sure that we're being consistent with how we do it within ourselves, if nothing else. I often tell my student coders when they're working on a qualitative project, if it's more important to me that you're wrong the same way every time than for you to be right some of the time. The consistency is the most important thing. And because, and here's the point, if we discover an error in the way you have been coding, uh, but you do it the same way every time, we can go back and rectify that error much more effectively, because we can go back and say, okay, well, every time you said this code means expression, and then I search for all the times that you identified expression. I can recode all of those and see if we have a more consistent and representative data outcome than when you were making the errors. So anyway, when we go to look at inter-observer agreement, or what people, as I said, used to refer to as inter-rater reliability, the simple way back in the day that I was out collecting, clipboard check marks on a playground, was a simple percent agreement approach. What we did was we identified how often that you and I looked at the same thing did we come back with the same score. And these usually were based on yes, no. It was present, was not present, something like that. The more effectively defined a behavior is, the easier it is to calculate these things. Those of you who work in special education or behavioral observation work, you know about getting a very clear and specific operational definition of the behavior you're trying to observe. Those of you who are scoring kind of open-ended interviews, it becomes a little fuzzier about how we get to classifying yes, no, saw this theme, didn't see that theme, etc. It becomes less precise because there's more nuance to your data. The key to this inter-observer reliability process is to make sure that you have replicability, so anybody can code the information, or anybody who is coding the information will be following the same process. I generally like to have 20 to 25% of the data go through an inter-observer agreement process. That's a personal preference. If you're using this methodology, 80% agreement is often the benchmark that people give. And I like to get ratings for both the independent variable, so if there's something that's predicting what's happening in a situation, so I'm watching the conditions, as well as the dependent variable, which is the actual outcome of the behaviors that the person is involved in. The problem with this is there's a lot of bias in this inter-observer agreement. And most people who do work in the qualitative field have recognized this is a limited perspective. It's fine if you're just trying to make sure that simple ratings of consistency come back at a level that's acceptable. However, if you want to get a little more nuanced and up to date with the practice, you can calculate something that's called the Cohen's kappa. And this is done more often when you're trying to judge the level of agreement between two or more raters, but you're aware that there can be bias in the ratings that people are giving. And I'm not going to walk you through all of this. You can pull these equations out yourself, but I'll just kind of explain what's going on here. So you see kappa in the first equation there is equal to p sub O minus p sub B divided by 1 minus p sub B. So what is all that? P sub O is the level of agreement between the participants. So this percent agreement approach, that's P sub O. That's all it is. So P sub O is calculated by finding out the number of times that the two raters came back with the same value. So if I have a simple scoring process of aggression or not aggression, right? And we're walking through, or watching a video, or watching a child in the field, and I see a behavior and I coded aggression, I turn to them and they also coded aggression, that's an agreement. You add up all the times, every behavior that we score, we see what number of times I said yes and you said yes, and the number of times I said no and you said no. Divide that by the total number of observations that were made. That's our percent agreement, or P sub O. As I said, that's rife with bias. So this is where kappa tries to factor out that bias. The way it does that is it estimates the probability that we would fall on the same answer just by chance, not because of the actual thing that we saw. And the way they do this is they calculate, and I'll just point down here, the percentage of time that we would say yes, and the percentage of time that we would say no, just by chance land on yes and no equitably. Now, you would think, well, there's a 50% chance that we're going to say yes and a 50% chance that we're going to say no. Not true, right? Because each person has their own sort of filter. So what we do is we calculate the number of times that, and I see I made a typo on this, the number of times that I said, this is the no, should say no, number of times I said no divided by the total cases, and the number of times you said no divided by the number of cases. And then I multiply those times each other. And that gives me the probability that we will both land on no, just regardless of what we see. And then I do the same thing for yes. Probability that I'd say yes, the probability you would say yes. So this controls for those folks who are like, no, that wasn't aggression. That was just, kids being kids. Versus the person who is like really specific, like, oh, no, that was highly aggressive, right? So those variations in our judgments of aggression or, niceness or whatever we're judging in the data we're looking at, it stabilizes those and controls for the probability that we're just gonna match up anyway. So if we both always say yes, then we're gonna have 100% agreement. But we know you're gonna have 100% agreement because you always say yes. So if you have a teacher who always gives everybody an A, then me getting an A doesn't really mean much, right? And that's what this is trying to factor out. Now, when you use Cohen's kappa, the values are very different than when we look at percent agreement. Like I said, 80% agreement is what we're generally looking for. If you're just doing the percent agreement approach, kappa's Cohen, these are the recommendations of what you should be shooting for when you compare two individuals. This calculation can be done for yes, no, for binary data. It can be done for 3-level data. It can be done for 4-level data. It just becomes more complicated because basically what happens is the number of chance landings. So I get the probability that we both say does not meet, and the probability that we both say meets, and the probability we say exceeds ability. So you got 3 levels of rating there. And then you can go to 4 levels of rating. It becomes more and more complicated as you go. If you're dealing with a qualitative data set that has like multiple codes that someone's going through, generally what you want to be focused on is, did the code that I am focused on, did you come to a similar representation of that code? Rather than trying to compare the 14 different codes that we had, and I said this and you said that would become impossible. We want to talk about, do we land on the same code if we identify a code? Oops. One more quick thing. When do we get inter-observer agreement? This is when we use these things. When we're trying to deal with reviewing permanent products, so archival data searches, this could be, some people will do a study of the notes and minutes from some organization to see what key factors or issues were being discussed by that individual. You can do text analyses of newspapers, for instance, doing this kind of stuff. What was the theme? What was the attitude of the community in the time period that I'm interested in? Things like that. Event recording is a process where I just track number of responses. Yes, no, again, we're dealing with this. You can also measure something we refer to as latency or duration. So latency is how long between when I expected something to happen and it actually happened. So how long between I said, go clean your room, and the child went and cleaned their room. So I would measure the duration between those two. Or I can look at duration and say, well, how long did you continue doing what I asked you to do? So pay attention. How long were you listening to the video that you're listening to right now, if you're still listening? So I could track how long that goes. And I would look for the inter-observer agreement on this by just measuring the time stamps. They said start and they said stop, right? And so I would compare those two values. For that, you're generally looking for a percent agreement because it's not just a responsive yes, no, things like that. Excuse me. And then finally, a lot of this comes down to, particularly if you're dealing with observation of behavior, and interval recording. And so the best example of this that I have is from my history is I used to walk around the playground with a clipboard in my hand watching this one particular child who was part of a study examining aggression. And the focus of the study was that playing with puppets in a therapy session with this child was going to reduce the level of aggression and increase the level of prosocial behavior the child exhibited on the classroom. I didn't have anything to do with the puppets. I was just, the person with the clipboard and a set of headphones. And the headphones would beep every 10 seconds, I think it was. And the point was, I would watch the child, and I had a check sheet in front of me, and I would code a 1 if the child identified aggression, a 0 if the child was dormant, not doing anything, and maybe it was a 2 if the child demonstrated a pro-social behavior in that 10-second block. So you're just going tick, 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 every 10 seconds, marking it. I didn't code if he did 10 positive behaviors. It was just at least 1. Now, if he had both of those, we had a way of coding that as well. So we would see they're in the same 10-second interval, which is pretty hard to do. They had both an aggression and a pro-social. So, I knock you down and then I say, hey, let me pick you back up, or something like that. That's an interval recording process where I'm just within that time period, did I see the target behavior at least once? People who do functional behavior analysis do these things a lot in special education or in behavioral intervention studies. Threats to inter-observer agreement. Real quickly, these are ways that your inter-observer agreement, when you have two judges looking at something, can break down. And these are the ways to kind of build into your training and your research process to make sure that we all agree on what's happening. First of all, one way that we can have a threat to inter-observer agreement is called reactivity. That's where we come closer together. You think, well, that's a good thing. Well, not necessarily, because again, we're dealing with qualitative research and we want our different perspectives to be represented. And in the end, if we're just coming to the same answer, get kind of a group think, you may not be effectively staying true to the data. You may just be coming down to a process of coaching your own answers to match whatever the primary coder's expectations may be. I worked on a project back in the 1990s where we had to travel to a test school in Atlanta where the authors of a classroom environment observation scale were working. And we had to go through their training process and show that we could have an 80% agreement with them when we walked through their test classroom. If you didn't reach that 80% criterion, you had to keep going back. And so in that case, they want to make sure everybody has the same representation. But what you have to be careful of there is that you're not arbitrarily drifting close to each other. Observer drift is another thing that you'll see, and that's where you code the same behavior differently over time, or you start adding things that you let count in that behavior or in that response criterion. And it's a common thing that happens. And the way you guard against this is basically take notes as you review your data and start to observe, like, how are you interpreting this? How are you changing this? And then review those notes. So a lot of people will take the notes, but they don't look back at the notes. And what you will often find is that you change the way you represent the world around you because multiple observations, you maybe start to build a different perspective than you had before. Other threats to inter-observer agreement is complexity. If you're dealing with a very complex or nuanced field, or you're dealing with like a huge interview process with lots of elements and topics, you're going to pick up on different things than other people may. That's okay. But the process, you have to build the process such that you're ensuring that the full intent and purpose and representation of the individual is being captured in your data coding. And one way, and we'll talk about this more in qualitative research later on, one way you can also guard against error in this way is to make it clear to your participants and or your readers or the people who are receiving your research synthesis, make it clear to them, these are my initial biases, this is the framework I'm coming from, so they can understand how you maybe developed your understanding of the data. Because maybe when you've give me a quote, I see it completely differently, but now I understand why you centered on those specific outcomes. And of course, that relates to your biases. We have expectations when we go into a study. We have prior experiences when we go into a study. We will pick up on things that are important to us and miss things that are not important to us or that do not fall into our worldview or our prior experiences. And those are all biases and expectations. They can all influence our inner observer agreements. Because of that, it's also important if you're working in a team setting to make sure it's clear to everybody where you're coming from with your interpretations so that you can come to a consensus on how to represent everybody's interpretations of data. That is it. Reliability and validity. It's the cornerstone of our research. Have a great day.